por el honor de estar aquí al lado de mi gran maestro Ali Ferdowsi, porque la charla va a ser en inglés. Yo también cambio el idioma al inglés. ¿No? I prefer to speak about Ali Ferdowsi not as in biographical terms, but as the impact he as a mentor and as an intellectual had, at least in myself and my generations, thought and the way of being and the way of thinking. The time that we rise in Iran, especially my generation, is after Islamic Republic, and many of the great Iranian intellectuals were forcibly sent away from Iran. Some were killed, and some were in exile. We had access to few of them, but always with fear, of meeting them. Sometimes like Ahmad, which was always under supervision, visiting him and many things like that. So we had a fearful circle of the intellectuals inside Iran, and exiled parts of the Iranian intellectual outside, and a big amount of the also Iranian thinkers, intellectual poets and writers killed, during the process to the Islamic Republic as their establishment. And the year that I entered into university, I had the luck of meeting some of the remaining intellectuals in Iran. And at that period, my generation were eager to understand what's going on, what happened to us, and how we can redefine and reinvent ourselves. And in those time, I had the chance, and then the honor to meet Ali through a common intellectual friend of us, Mr. Askari Pashai, who was also close friend, mentor, and to Ahmad Shamlu. And there I recognized that we, under the lack of many texts in Iran, because you were not, many books were censored and everything like that. So one side of the Iranian intellectuality was not absent, but was silenced in Iran, especially the part of the Mashrute close to the Western thought, what generally calling to the Western thought, were silenced, by the circles of the Islamic Republic, which were trying to Islamize everything. And in this process, Ali was a gateway, a true gateway for us to first-handly touch some of those figures and intellectuals, Western thinkers, and also our historic past. I myself, for example, get the courage and also the passion of reading Malcolm Khan, one of the main figure of the Mashrute period or Iranian constitution, through the advices and of Ali, and many other of us, Haj Sayyad, Malcolm Khan, and all the somehow Western circle, not Ayatollah circle, involved in the Mashrute period, were introduced to us in Iran, but at least to my generation, at some very more detailed points by Ali to us. And also thinkers like Foucault and, in my case, Lakoff and many others were introduced by Ali to me. And the conversation that Ali kept through after returning back from his own exile to Iran, he was 18 years in exile. And after returning back to Iran with a bit of opening of the space in the time of the reformists, he involved with the constant conversation with my generation of activists, thinkers, or academics. So I believe that my generation of it's very in depth with Ali and his approach and his way of scientifically mainly approaching to the text, which mainly were spoken before poetically or somehow. In that sense, I want to mention that it was mainly the gesture of rhetoric than the reason speaking inside the text. So I want to, thanks Ali for being with us here. And with this introduction, I want us to get into understanding one of the, works that Ali did on Sultan Ahmad Jalayir. And one of the institution in Iran, or super institution in Iran, which is very important to understand Iranian identity. And I guess that through these, we can probably get more closer to understanding of Ferdowsi and also the recent history of Iran. Thank you, Ali.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the kind words and for an excellent introduction to our contemporary predicament and situation in Iran. I also, before I start, I want to thank the Institute and particularly Dr. Shakoufa Mohammadi. It's hard for me because by now I call her Shakoufa, for having extended this invitation to me to come and speak at this great university, and having come to Mexico. This is my first time, and I was surprised, honestly, because the narrative inside which I had a picture of this great country was very much dominated, to my own surprise, by the way it was constructed in the English language in North America. So I'm glad that I came here. And once again, I found out how captive you are inside of someone else's narrative of each other. And I hope today in my talk, I can provide somewhat a different picture of not only Iran and the powers of Iranian culture, particularly the Persian language, but also the place of poetry in Iran. Now, I chose the topic place of poetry in very many different meanings that the place could have. So the place of poetry is first basically a historical or sociological concept. Where did poetry published? Where did it first appear? So that's what is the place of poetry. The other one is the place of poetry in the constitution of the sense of Iranianness. And thirdly, is the place of Sultan Ahmad inside that constitution of the Iranian identity. So okay, thank you. Just before I start, this Sultan Ahmad, he was born in 1357, reigned from 1382, and was brutally murdered in 1410. He was a descendant of Turco-Mongol invaders of Iran. And within 4 or 5 generations, as we shall see, he became so thoroughly Iranian. Then when Tamerlane, the Amir Timur, invaded Iran, he considered himself the protector of Iran against the invasion of Turco-Mongol people. So we can see within 3 or 4 generations how quickly Iranian civilization was able to bring in a Turco-Mongol king and make him a Persian monarch, a Persian king, who would defend the identity of the people. The time in which he ruled are considered the period of interregnum, because after the collapse of the Mughal or Ilkhanid Empire in Iran in 1335, for the next 70, 80 years, there was no central government in Iran. About 15 or 16 different dynasties ruled all over the Iranian land. And so it's called, a historian of the time considers that, of course, this is the historian who thinks that Iran needs to have a powerful central government to be able to protect itself. And you cannot protect Iran because it's a naturally unprotected civilization. It's not like India or like China or like Japan. Iran is absolutely, from every side of it, you can come to Iran and conquer Iran. And so it takes a lot of work, cultural work, civilizational work to maintain that identity, because there's nothing to protect the Iranian identity over the thousands of years that it has existed. So he calls it the Shab Parishani Alam, the night of the world destitution or confusion, Parishani. And then almost as soon as Sultan Ahmad died, this is a summary, so within a year or so after his murder, that he says he spent most of his time in flight and far from home, and did not enjoy a single day of tranquility, roaming stranded, sometime in Egypt, sometime in Anatolia. That was his life. For the 28 years that he was a king, most of it I was running away from, particularly from Tamerlane, or he was fighting with other contenders, because Iran was at the time divided among many dynasties. And yet he produced a tremendous amount of poetry. I just compared him very quickly because I don't want to dwell too much on that. I compared me with three of his contemporary poets. The court poet Salman Sawaji, which is the third line or the second after the titles. How many poems he produced, and then the different types of poems, and then Kamal Khojandi, who was his contemporary, lived in Tabriz, and then of course the famous poet Hafez. And we can see that he's really produced, even though he was running away and fighting, he had this relationship with Persian language and Persian poetry, that he would just ceaselessly compose Persian poetry. At every time that he felt destitute, he felt angry, he felt sad, which is most of the time he felt really very, very sad. He felt very much vulnerable. He composed Persian poetry. So Persian poetry was not only a poetry of, say, outer or outside of his being, but was really the expression of his inner person. And that's one of the points that I want to emphasize, that how someone from a totally different tradition within 3-4 generations is made an Iranian from the inside, not just in terms of allegiance as a king or pretending as a king that I am the king of Iran, but also really feeling and experiencing his own life inside of the Iranian realm of feeling and experience. He considered himself a poet, and actually he has quite a number of poems that he feels very sad that he was born a prince and has to be a king. He preferred to be a Persian poet, but he had no choice but to be a king, because sometimes when you are born into a royal family, you just they don't have a choice. People think that everybody wants to be a king, but that's not true. There are people who don't want to be king and yet have to be the king. And he's one of them. So he published his own books while he was alive, and sometimes multiple publications. So I just showed that several of these manuscripts that that he's published over his lifetime. He was a talented ruler, a patron of arts and of a poetic disposition. This is something that was written about him 100 or a couple of 170 years later. He composed good poetry in Arabic and Persian. The Arabic part is not really so true, is because this Iranian guy is quoting what the Arabs said about him. He has a few quatrains in Arabic, but 99.999% of his poetry is in Persian. But he knew Arabic and he knew Turkish. As the king of their Baghdad, which was had both Turkish population, Persian population, and Arab population. He was proficient in many crafts such as painting, illumination, bow making, arrow making, inlay, khatam bandi, which is now one of the supreme arts of in Iran. He's probably we know that it is, this word, khatam bandi, appears in relation to him for the first time in the history of Iran. And it's quite possible that he is the inventor of that art form. And wrote the 6 pens. At the time, there were only 6 styles of Persian writing, and the 7th was actually created in his own court. In the science of music and modes, he was a master, and several books in the science, in musical sciences, were composed by him. So you can see what an erudite king he was. His poetry shows that he was learned in the cultural literacy, astrology, astronomy, philosophy, Sufism, history, geography, literature, as any of his illustrious contemporaries like Salman Savaji, Kamal Khojandi, Hafez, etc. Now, I don't know, this is really a little bit not as sharp as a picture, but this is a page of his divan. The calligraphy that you see, this is called Nasta'li. This was invented in his court, and it's now the highest form of Persian calligraphy. Is still the calligraphy that was composed at his court. And the drawings, and the marginal drawings, show a nomadic picture, landscape. Children are playing at the bottom. This is by a great Persian painter by the name of Abdul Hayy from Baghdad. But he was a student of Haj Shamsuddin, who was from Shiraz. And later on, because Islam is anti-painting, anti-music, anti-dance, and I say that because most people these days say Islamic music. There is no such thing. There is no Islamic painting. All those things are really confiscation of the heritage of which does not belong to the world of Islam as a religion. Now, Muslims, of course, have painting. Muslims, of course, have poetry, but they are not Islamic. They are not from Islam. They are not, you see what I'm saying? It's not like, because we have this picture of the Christian church in which painting, music, many things come out. We also think that Islam is a similar religion. It's not at all. It's more in this sense like Judaism, which bans some of these artistic practices. Next, this is again by his contemporary, Junaid Naqash Sultani. His signs, Junaid Naqash Sultani, means Junaid, the painter of the royal painter. So as for the Sultan Ahmad, Junaid Baghdadi. And the two between Junaid is also a student of Haj Shamsuddin from Shiraz. They are very different. And Junaid, in order to avoid these Islamic injunctions about doing painting, he makes it abstract. He makes it non-realistic. So because it's realistic painting that is normal. So it makes it more as you can see, totally mushes up the space, the figures, everything becomes symbolic. So everything is relating to something that does not belong into this world. Abdul Hayy, on the other, was absolutely a realistic painter. And because of that, towards the end of his life, like many people, when they grow older, become a little bit more religious, he became religious. And he has spent the rest of his life going and finding his own painting and washing them away. So very few of his paintings survived, because as a Muslim, he thought that he would go to hell, and so he had to destroy. The poem here is beautiful. This is from Khaju of Kerman, and it has nothing to do with my presentation, but I love it so much. He says, "Daromicht ba ou cho shahd o shekar be rogan furu bord khormay tar." Is absolutely, this is about the wedding scene, and it's about the consummation of the husband and wife, the newlywed, and I don't know, blended with her like nectar and sugar. I mean, this is really absolute blending, and dipped the succulent date into the oil, because that was it. They would have melted butter and dip the date, palm date into it. It's beautiful. I mean, it's really erotic. And the picture is showing that. So you can see all that stuff. The girl is, I don't know where to put it, but you can see it, right? I hope so. I don't know. Okay, now really to the core, the core of my presentation. For me, as a student of history, the question was, why did Sultan Ahmad compose so many poems? And to whom did he present his poetry? Of course, we are all familiar with court poets, right? They compose poetry for the queen or for the king, and they go and present it, and they are part of the entertainment or justification or legitimation of the king. But when the king himself is the poet, then what happens, right? That's the question. And so it seems to me that, okay, this is it, I think. My hypothesis is, okay, like someone who was trained in positivistic form of discourse, my hypothesis is Sultan Ahmad's composing poetry, and so much of it can in part be understood as the performance of a special role by him in the institution of royal banquet as the immediate setting of the publication of artistic creation as a moment in an economy that includes the royal workshop. He had a royal workshop. It's incredible. Every time that he was running away from Tamerlane or anybody, the first thing that he would try to save was his royal workshop and his poets and his calligraphers and all the things that they, like, more than his weapons. I mean, his attachment to this art was so strong that he was running away and trying to take his poets and his musicians with him. I mean, not like his generals. I mean, it's really, and he liked, and the institution was what we call royal, I said royal banquet, the royal banquet, but in Persian it's usually said the banquet of intimate. So these are the close people in which the king presents his poetry or his painting or calligraphy. Others do, and they discuss it and criticize it. And I'm jumping ahead of the story because I think I will have to skip some of the slides. But the king wants at the same time to say, I'm not only a king on land, the king of the territory, the king of the realm, my realm, but I am also a king inside of the culture. I am also the king of culture. I mean, that's his attempt is to show himself as being a cultured, a cultivated monarch. Which is very important in Iran. Even now in the Islamic Republic, many people, when they want to become president, you remember everybody would put, like prescription glasses on to appear like, I am really, I'm into reading and I'm into this. I look like an intellectual because the history of Iran has the concept of monarchy as kind of artistic, intellectual, philosopher king idea, that kind of a thing. But this banquet of intimate was inside of a bigger picture, which we could call borrowing from many centuries later in the Western context, a republic of letters. So there are many of these kinds of banquets, not only by Sultan Ahmad, but also by a couple of other courts, but also by a lot of wealthy people and top officials like prime ministers in different realms in Iran at that time. And they were communicating with each other, and they were sending poetry to each other and painting to each other. And when Sultan Ahmad was publishing his poetry, which some of them had this beautiful miniature painting, which appears in their court actually for the first time, not his court, but his father. But they would share that with each other. So there is an inside, even though Iran is in a sense not integrated into one empire, culture remains integrated throughout this whole period. Okay, does it make sense? Yeah, culturally there is still one Iran, but in terms of political rule, is many Irans at the time. And each one of them claims to be the only and the true Persian king. So I've already defined that. Everything I want to say, I guess I've already said. Okay. Okay, this is very quickly is too much information in that. If you look at Sultan, one thing, in a sense, what I am saying has not been said as concretely, at the very least, as I am now saying it. And this, what my 20 years, I first touched the Divan of Sultan Ahmad Jalayir, Rear Gallery of Washington, D.C., in the March 3rd of March 2002. And the book that finally came out was in 2022. So for 20 years, I spent thousands of hours, the best part of my life, in understanding this king. He was a very tragic king. And I don't know, like there are days and nights that I just feel like I know him personally, and I just want to hug him and give him solace, because he's suffered a lot. He's suffered a lot. And he has a lot of personal psychological issues as well. But when you take that book, because when you have a king for the first time in the history of Arabs and Persians and Turks, and probably throughout much of the world, that you have 10,000 couplets of poetry, full divan of a poetry by a king, you can all of a sudden relate history to the king's poetry in such a way that you could not do with the court poets, because we don't have their biography. But in the case of a king, biography and history come very close, and many times they merge and become one and the same. So all of a sudden, all the historical things that appear to be, old Iranian history about king, yeah, but this time the king is the poet, so that history about the king is the history about the poet. Right? So you can really then use it and understand Persian poetry and its context better than it was possible when we were trying to do it with Hafez or with Sadi or with Ferdowsi. Yeah. And so there are hundreds of references to this banquet of intimates. Usually it's called Majlis Khas, a special assembly, Majlis Khasan, assembly of the select, Majlis Shahi, royal assembly, and so on and so forth. And he's referring to them. And there are many other things. So majlis is Arabic word. And in this context, is very close to what we call in Persian bazm, or a banquet, or symposium in the original Greek term. And actually, they are part of the legacy of symposium that persisted throughout Iran and bifurcated both into the Sufi majlis, and also to the royal court. So we can take that back, far back into the history, and that is somewhat documented, that comes from that heritage. I just give some examples. The king is saying that this is the banquet of poets, and all the poets are present. And now after that, he turns to the musicians and says, "Okay, now stop for a moment, because the poets are here, and now the music was playing, and now all the poets have arrived." And the king says, "Okay, now stop it." And also says that the cupbearer was giving wine to everybody. It says, "Stop it," so that the poets can start presenting their poetry. You can see that the line is very clear, and you don't need much interpretation to see what's going on there. Sometimes they drank while they did it. There are many ways to do that. And the king usually, so they call it mahfil, a circle. And he also says they are all the good ones, all the best ones of the realm are present here. So it's very obvious. And sometimes they would compose deliberately for the assembly. Sometimes they would bring the older Persian poetry for presentation. But usually they would prepare for these assemblies, meaning the king himself prepared himself, composed a poem for the upcoming assembly. Other poets composed poetry before they came to the assembly. Musicians composed musical pieces before they came to the assembly. And they were really decorated with lots and lots of flower, lots of candle. Sometimes the flowers on the floor were so much that you really had to walk on like a thicket of snow. And there is one example that there was so much petals, rose petals in a banquet, that when someone all of a sudden stormed into the banquet, because one of the persons in the banquet had slept with someone's wife, the guy could hide under the petals of flower. I mean, this is the amount of to create the smell, the aroma. So these are highly decorated, highly organized, ritualized settings. I mean, I wish Islamic Republic would leave Iran as soon as possible, because then we could make better soap operas than the Koreans and the Chinese and the Japanese in terms of our royal courts and the stories that happen in our royal courts. But let's see. I hope that I live long enough to see that happen. Mostly, the essential point here is that the relationship in the banquet is lateral, horizontal. There is no difference between king and everybody in this regard. And we have to understand that Iranian monarchy is highly hierarchicized. In this one, no, there is no hierarchy. The hierarchy is totally suspended. Everybody is a poet. Everybody is a musician. It's a realm of a different kind of experience. I think the king really needs that as well. I mean, psychologically needs it, but also it needs it in terms of being cultivated, so that when he talks to other people, when he communicates diplomatically, he's the master of Persian language, allusions, indirect speech, and all of that stuff happens in this training of a king and the rehearsal of things. Just a couple of people. One of the greatest person at the court of Sultan Ahmad is the so-called Khaja maestro Abdul Qadir Maraghi from Maraghi in Azerbaijan. The real Azerbaijan, which is on the south of Aras River, the upper Mazandaran at this time called is Aran, and it's not called Azerbaijan. This is his historic fact. And it's not part of the Jalayir territory. It's part of another Iranian monarchy called Shirvanshah, and it's Persian court, but it's not part of Azerbaijan at the time. At the time, still Azerbaijan is mostly a Persian-speaking territory. Turks are just entering into the picture, but because Black Death, which hit Europe, hits Iran, particularly western part of Iran, around the same time, the urban population, Persian-speaking urban population, gets decimated, and the Turks who were nomadic around the cities come and form government, and the Turkification of Azerbaijan happens actually in this century, towards the end of this century. Okay. No, the maestro Abdul Qadir is one of the greatest theoretical and practical musicians of any civilization. Absolutely any civilization. He has written 4 or 5 books, theoretical books on music, and he was apparently extremely handsome man. Extremely handsome. I mean, really, because everybody who writes about him is mesmerized by his looks. He has beautiful voice. He plays oud, lute, just incredibly well. And his demeanor and his ability to be entertaining is incredible. And he devotes a big chapter of one of his theoretical books about the art of performance, not in terms of musicality, in terms of the comportment of a musician in a place. You know, when you are performing, how you are supposed to sit, how you are supposed to dress, how you are supposed to talk, what you, including you should not eavesdrop, and if you did hear something, you should never outside disclose, and all kinds of things. It's a beautiful manual pamphlet in the beginning of one of his books about that. The king is okay. I recently, well, not recently, after the book on Sultan Ahmad came out. Oh, by the way, I'm so sorry, I forgot. An Iranian young PhD candidate by the name of Dr. Sanaz Rajabian, from Shiraz, my favorite city, and she's a Shirazi girl, and there is no Iranian man that when you say someone is a Shirazi girl does not develop a particular softness in the heart. She and I collaborated. I mean, I had finished it, I'd sent it for the publisher, but then she communicated with me and said, oh, I'm working my PhD dissertation and I did not know that you have finished it. I said, okay, I will stop it and we will collaborate together. It's better the two of us work together. And we did work together, and she contributed as much as I did, except for the introduction, which I'd already written in his mind. But that in terms of the critical edition, we are equal between the two of us. And I hope that she would be able to leave Iran because she's suffering now. Anyway, after that came out, I discovered a poem. Discover is really an exaggeration, but I found a poem by Abdulqadir Maraghi, the maestro. It has 80 couplets, and he composed it when he was 80 years old, one couplet per year. And he goes over his own biography. And part of it, he says, well, I was at this court and at this court and at this court. And part of it is about the court of Sultan Ahmad. And he says he always called me my dear friend. And he's so proud that Sultan Ahmad called him Yar Aziz, my dear friend. And then when Sultan Ahmad is murdered, by that time, Abdulqadir Maraghi is at the court of Shahrukh, the Timurid in Herat. My hometown used to be a village of Herat. I'm from Iran, but that's exactly almost near the border between Iran and Afghanistan. And he composes a poem for the passing away of his king, that he really loved him. He really loved him. So quickly, most, if not all, of Sultan Ahmad's poems addressed to Abdulqadir belong to the period they spent together. Some of them are apparently composed in the maestro's absence as reminiscences and expressions of longing for reunion. This separation forever marks Sultan Ahmad. It's so obvious that after Timur came, and Abdulqadir and Sultan Ahmad and poets and Abdul Hayy and others were trying to run away in the deserts near Karbala in present-day Iraq. They finally caught up with them. And Sultan Ahmad managed by fighting, and his hand was basically, with all kinds of things anyway, to this a very cinematic scene that we have a contemporary of one of those people who was present and who fled and went and hid in the shrine of Imam Hussein. Explains they were the painter and the musician were caught by Tamerlane forces and relocated to Shahrazad, Samarkand, to be at his court. But Sultan Ahmad forever after that, because he lived many, many years after, like about 15 years after that separation. And for that period of separation, his longing for his maestro is touching. He really misses him a lot. He misses him not to be at his court. He misses not listening to his music. When he's sad, his music is not there to console him. And he constantly says that. Praises several praises of Khaja Abdul Qadir. I don't have the time, but you can see that. I mean, in English translation. This I will read the Persian, and if you want to read the English translation, poor bad translations of the King's book. In Khaja ma ke hast Abdul Qadir shod mahir ilm ha be hukm qadir dar majlis ma hame pasandide bod az vei ke shavad zeni ko badha sadir. It's a beautiful poem. It says whatever he does in our banquet, good or bad, we will accept it. We will like it. You know, that's the king talking to a musician. It's important because many Iranians did not have this perception of their royalty, of their king. My generation, I was so anti-king, I spent some time in jail fighting him. And now I regret. I absolutely regret. I went to Egypt. I went to the tomb of the last, maybe the latest, maybe the last Shah of Iran. And I apologized, although I was in his jail and I was tortured, electric shocks and beating. But now I think that I was wrong. I should have not fought against him. I should have known that there is alternative power sitting there to jump at any power vacuum that could be created, which is not to praise him, but to understand how difficult it was to run a country like Iran when you have another super institution. These are my terminology. I just invented because I think modern West thinks that there are many, many institutions, but in Iran, only two institutions. All other institutions belong to either this one or that one. Institute of Music belongs to the king at the high level, institutions of painting, poetry, all of that stuff. Or the spaces that the king could protect against the Islamist or jurisprudent version of Islam. Anyway, these are again some of his poems. And here, this is actually very interesting. This line says, he says about his beloved, you see that Yar Aziz again, his dear friend, his beloved friend. It is in the king's divan, at the title of the poem. So when Abdul Qadir says, oh, he used to call me Yar Aziz, we know that he is right. We see that independently. Okay, quickly to Hafez, because Hafez is not at his court. Sultan Ahmad very strongly desired Hafez to be in that gathering, because he had the best poet of the realm at the time. He had the best calligrapher of the realm at the time. He had the best painter of the realm at the time, but he did not have the best poet of the realm at the time. And he was doing his best to get him to come to his court, because he thought, oh my God, this is what, like imagine if you have all of them together, what kind of an experience I could have, right? What you see would be like going to the seventh heaven. But it never happened. But there are about 60 poems that are communicated between Sultan Ahmad and Hafez that before the publication of Sultan Ahmad's Divan, we could not know. We did not know. We did not know who is he talking to. And some people thought, oh, he's talking to the divine. No. He was not talking to the divan. He was talking to the other king. But he was distant, and he was making him appear to have this divine aspects, and be, the distance was really the distance between Baghdad and Shiraz. You know what I'm saying? It was more concrete. But of course, in the hands of a poet like Hafez, even he talks about the dead rat becomes divine. We have to remember that it's the power of Hafez that bestows divinity on things, not the divine that it bestows power on Hafez. General observation. Okay, and we are at what time it is? Okay. General observation. I don't know what the first line means anymore. There was this thing that somebody wrote something and said, what did you write? He said, when I wrote, I knew what I wrote and God knew what I wrote, but now only God knows what I wrote. Is that situation now? I have no idea what is that twin thing about. Anyway, okay, that's just because I don't want to speculate about what I myself wrote. So let's move to the next one. The function of the royal banquet. So it's both a spiritual and it has both a spiritual and cultural function. The royal banquet of intimates were not mere booze parties, because there's another, how would I say, misrepresentation in Iranian literature that the kings all just sat down with the office and drank booze. No, these are real cultural settings in which culture is taking place, in which production of culture, discussion of culture is taking place. It's not, of course, they are drinking sometimes, but it does not mean that these are just about booze parties. Because the poetry itself, if you don't have this historical context, make it appear like that, because that's part of the creation of a culture of equality and non-hierarchical culture, and in the realm of being drunk, everything is equal to everything, and there is openness, and there no longer you have to hide your truths because you are drunk. So this is part of the picture of the banquet. We have to remember these are like the iconic aspects of how a banquet is supposed to be, not literally the idea that they sat there and there's that buckets of wine. It's not like that at all. They were a kind of academy for cultural production, for the top organic intellectuals, because they all belong to the court. They are also helping the court to be the court. right? So it's not like Hafez is composing for the king and then king in return patronizes him or gives him money. It's not at all that. As I say in the next slide, basically the king, Sultan Ahmad and Hafez belong to the same world hypothesis, to the same picture of the world. The king needs the poet needs the king. Both of them are protecting themselves against the power of the mosque. And so I can prove that. There are so many, many clear instances that you can show that if it was not for Shah Shuja, therefore Hafiz calls him the most just of all kings of all times. If it was not for Shah Shuja, the mullahs would have excommunicated Hafiz and probably would have killed him. We can document that, both inside of Hafez and also by outside documentation of someone who wrote about 30 years after the death of Hafez. So we can say that for a fact. So I call them organic intellectuals, like Gramscian kind of, borrowing, something like that. Not art and poetry alone, but a whole discursive formation was involved, a whole culture, a whole theological, political ideology that stood in contradistinction with the mosque madrasa orientation and certain tendencies among the Sufis. Because Sufis really existed in the space between mosque and the court. And when at least in the age in this time that we talk about, the Sohrawardis, which were the dominant Sufi tendency around this time, both in Baghdad and in Shiraz, they were trying to basically make sure that philosophy would not flourish in either Baghdad or in Shiraz. Every time they could influence the court, they would have the philosophy manuscript to be burned or washed. And the poets sometimes, in order to survive, went along with the Rawardis, the Sufis, and with the mosque attacking the philosophers. So we can see a lot of anti-philosophical discourse in Persian poetry as a compromise with the power of the mosque and some Sufi orders. More than legitimation in return for patronage, but mutual authorization. The king authorizes the poet authorizes. It's just a particular production of a particular field of authority and power between the two of them. It's not one or the other. It's not that simplistic, in other words. It's not just a economic or financial transaction. Oh, I'll give you poem, maybe give some money. It's not that cheap. It's not really that cheap as most people think. The Persian poet needs the king, no less than the king needs him. Kings are directly related and essential to the Persian art in ways that Islam is not. Islam is not essential for the art of Persian poetry. The king is. I know these are very radical. It's totally the opposite of what has been said. But fortunately for that thick divan, this is the stick. We cannot say that. The kings are directly related and says art in ways that Islam is not. By legitimating the king, the poet legitimates a world of which he is a part and from which he receives his power to legitimize. Where does if the poet can legitimize the king, where does the poet gets the power to legitimize? It's a circle. Does it make sense? The system legitimizes the poet legitimizes the system. It's integral, it's organic, that relationship. It's not, there is no other relationship. The king and the poet relate to each other in a vacuum. That's the working assumption of contemporary Iranian way of thinking about the relationship between art and the court. It's just, you know what I'm saying? Is like in a barren land, the king is there and the poet goes, I got you a poem. And he says, oh, I give you some coins. It's not like that at all. There is a system. And that system has to be understood. Regime function as a basis for Sonamaz and poetry. The regime, by regime function, I mean what I've already said, so I don't belabor the point again. The king has to say that I am also a king in a realm of culture that is not religion, because the realm of religion as culture belongs to the mosque and the mullah. And the king wants to say that there is another realm of culture that does not belong to the mosque, does not be, and madrasa, and this realm of culture is the one that I belong to. So I am the one who patronizes poetry. I am the one who patronizes music. I am the one who patronizes painting. You see my point. I mean, you don't need to agree with that, but just do you see my point? I hope that you do, right? Okay, generally, that's it. Okay, I will conclude by one thing, because that is really something that is very essential to my labor past 20 years, is to reduce the realm of claims of the mosque and madrasa, and to show that Iran existed before Islam, exists outside of Islam, and can continue to exist without Islam. And I ended with that. Thank you so much for being so patient.
Thank you very much, Ali.
Thank you very much. I guess that we continue with the question, but for a starting point, I ask one simple question and then we go. The question here is probably in the discourse when reading it from the Mexico, for example, which poetry doesn't have the place that it has for Iranians, why poetry? And this a specific relationship between poetry and the king, and why not other forms of the art or practice of the language?
Good question. I mean, I think this. I think I can project. It's okay. We don't need this. But very good question. First of all, I tried to show that there were other things that involved as well. But I think in the very essence of creating a poetic language, which is so Persian, Iran asserts its authentic national self. What do I mean by that? By the time, by the 10th, 11th century, in the Islamic world, the Arabic language has become the language of Sharia law, is the language of faqih. And people are beginning to feel that their relationship with the divine, not necessarily with this Allah of their guy with me, like me, with bearded guy who sits there and judges everybody. I do all of that myself in my real life. But not that, but the divine, it's the transcendent, that's the all. By that time, that relationship can no longer be expressed in Arabic. And that is where the Persian language, Persian poetry starts. It starts with a great Persian poet by the name of Sanai, that Rumi later on mentions him as one of his forerunners. Now, Sanai comes up with the idea. This is around the time of Umar Khayyam lives, around the time of the great Abu Hamid Ghazali, his brother Ahmad Ghazali, the great politician Khaja Nizam-ul-Mulk. This is a very crucial watershed moment in the history of Iran. And at that time, Sanai comes up with that, because in Islam, there is, as you know, there is a chapter in the Quran that is anti-poets. Because the question was, does the poet relate to the divine directly, or only the prophet relates to the divine? Does a poet have directly access to it? Or the access between man and God is mediated by prophets, not by the poets? This is the question that chapter tries to answer. Sanai comes and says, the poets have exactly the same immediate and direct access to the divine as the Prophet Muhammad. And all of a sudden, Persian poetry becomes the language of the relationship between man and the divine. And then because of that, it spreads all the way from India to Bosnia-Herzegovina, because it becomes the language of the greater truth, the truth of all truths. And Persian poets after that will have a status, not only as the guarantor of the Persian language, which has already started with Ferdowsi, but also as the guarantor of the particular relationship between the divine and the humankind, the medium of which is not Arabic, but is Persian. There are so many poems in Persian that very indirectly allude to it, because saying it directly, even what I now say directly, would be considered blasphemous. And by indirectly say that, indirectly they compare poets with the prophet, or they say that, oh, in the Persian language, there is a book. So the Arab or the Prophet Muhammad brought the word of God to earth. The Persian poet took the world of the earth to the level of the divine. So they are very clearly know what they are doing. They want to make God speak Persian. Let's put it this way, very clearly. Because an Iranian cannot tolerate God speaking another language. So they had to force God to learn Persian. And they did teach God to speak Persian. He spoke Persian more clearly for centuries, better than Arabic. And today is especially Persian language that speaks the truth of the divine, not the Arabic at all. I'm sorry it becomes a sloganeering a little bit, but I'm a political person. I can't help pushing it in to that extreme.
Thank you, Ali. If you have any question, would be here. We have time to listen to the question and answer.
The system of the translation poets or gases of Hafez in the poet was made to prove that he was more powerful than the Sultan was to reach with the throne of
Absolutely. I'm glad that you really saw it, I mean, without me having to say it. Yes. And in the 60-some poems that have been exchanged between the king and the poet at Hafez, it's obvious that it's the king that considers Hafez to be his superior. He absolutely understands that. And so he talks to him, invites him with a humility that is again against everything that when I was fighting against the Shah, I thought, and that was my image of the king. But he was, yes, absolutely, you are right. Because, but the point that you added to my talk was, which was not my thought, but I'm glad that you mentioned it, is that because he owned the land. I did not see it that clearly as now you expressed it. Thank you so much.
More questions?
Okay.
Okay.
Shall we? Okay, thank you so much. Okay. چه خوب 12 تموم شد.